When people picture a medieval war camp, they usually imagine banners, armor, and proud knights getting ready for battle. The real thing was far less heroic. It was mud, bad water, rotting food, sick soldiers, exhausted horses, and the constant fear of being caught off guard. These are 12 harsh truths about medieval war camps that movies almost never show. Number 1. Built for survival. A medieval war camp was not just a random patch of tents dropped on open ground. When commanders had the time to choose properly, they looked for a place that could actually keep the army alive. Medieval military law from Castile says a camp should not sit under high ground where an enemy could dominate it, and it should not be placed in marshy land or where running water could become a problem. At the same time, the camp needed to be near water, grass, and wood, because an army could not function without drinking water, animal fodder, fuel, and building material. That already tells you something important. A camp was chosen less for comfort than for survival. And once the site was picked, the layout could be surprisingly deliberate. The Lord's tent was meant to stand in the center, important officers around him, and the rest of the army arranged behind them, almost like the streets of a town. Banners were used to mark where groups belonged, so men could find their places and commanders could keep order. If the army expected to stay for a while, manuals advised a ditch around the camp, night guards, scouts in the surrounding countryside, and special care for the baggage train, because that was often the first thing the enemy tried to hit. So, the first harsh truth is simple. A medieval camp was not a romantic backdrop for heroic speeches. It was a defensive machine built around water, animals, supply, and fear of surprise. Number 2. Camp was mostly work. And once the camp existed, most of what happened inside it was not glorious at all. It was labor. A war camp needed clerks to track supplies, carpenters to build and repair, laborers to haul things, carters to move loads, servants to watch storage, and men under arms to protect every vulnerable part of the system. In preparations for Edward I's Gascon campaign in 1294, royal officials hired scribes, carpenters, laborers, assistants, and carters, took over buildings near the port, arranged grazing land for herds, and began modifying storage space even before the main host arrived. That does not sound like a cinematic army waiting proudly for battle. It sounds like a giant, moving job site. Medieval military law says the same thing from another angle. Troops had to send out protected parties to fetch wood, grass, water, and straw. Those supply groups were expected to move in good order, stay armed, use scouts, and avoid straggling, because even a trip to collect basic necessities could turn into an ambush. In other words, camp life ran on constant chores. Men cut timber, dug, carried, repaired, guarded, sorted, counted, cooked, and moved animals. Even a successful camp was never still. It was always building, fetching, storing, or protecting something. That is why the image of medieval soldiers spending all day polishing armor and waiting for trumpets is so misleading. Most of camp life was physical work done under pressure, and a badly managed camp could fall apart long before a battle ever began. Number 3. Food was never settled. That work mattered because food was never a solved problem. In many medieval European armies, soldiers were expected to arrive with their own bread and provisions for a fixed period. In the Crown of Aragon, examples survive of troops being summoned with arms, equipment, and bread for anything from a few days to as much as 3 months, after which the ruler had to shoulder the burden of keeping them supplied. That sounds manageable on paper,
But in practice, it meant every campaign was racing the food clock.
Once the self-supported period ran out, the army became a moving population that needed daily bread, grain, water, fodder, storage, transport, and money. One study of Aragonese campaigning says the camp itself produced no food of its own except what might come from hunting, so it constantly needed replenishment. Medieval rulers used three basic answers again and again. They lived off the land where possible, transported stores, or built supply depots in advance. Usually, they tried all three. The records for the Gascon expedition show just how concrete this was. Officials gathered bread, flour, beans, beef, mutton, bacon, fish, oats, hay, tons for liquids, sacks for grain, and even salt for preservation. And not all of it was simply handed out for free. Some horse fodder was issued without charge, but leaders still had to pay for much of the food meant for human consumption. So the harsh truth here is that joining a medieval army did not mean entering a fully supported machine that took care of every meal. Very often, food was a constant negotiation between what men brought, what rulers could organize, what towns could provide, and what the countryside could still spare. Number 4. Horses ate the army. Once you see how unstable food supply was, the horse problem becomes even bigger. Medieval war movies love horses because they look impressive, but the real story is logistical. Horses did not just carry nobles into battle. They drank, grazed, consumed grain, needed rest, and forced armies to think constantly about distance and speed. One study of horse logistics in medieval warfare makes the point very clearly. A pack horse carrying about 200 pounds could haul the feed needed for itself and one war horse for only about 2 days if water was available along the route. If hay could be found on the way, that could stretch further, but not indefinitely. This is why large mounted forces could not simply carry everything they needed for long periods.
Even the vehicles meant to support them had their own limits. Horse-drawn transport was often impractical because the draft animals also needed grain, so oxen were frequently preferred for hauling loads, even though that slowed the baggage train dramatically. And there was another limit that movies almost never show. A horse that had already covered a serious distance that day was not automatically ready to charge in top condition. Campaign speed, combat readiness, and supply were tied together. The Gascon records show just how large the burden could become, with hay and oats issued for more than 1,500 horses before the expedition even sailed. So one of the harshest truths about a medieval camp is that the glamorous war horse was also a massive liability. Armies needed grass, oats, water, space, handlers, and time just to keep mounted power from collapsing. If the horses weakened, the whole army slowed down with them. Number 5. Clean water was a battle. And that brings us straight to the next problem. Because where there are hundreds or thousands of men and animals, water stops being a simple matter. Medieval manuals and law codes repeatedly show that commanders understood this. They wanted camps near water, but not in swampy or unhealthy ground. They warned against letting sanitary needs be dealt with inside the camp because the smell itself was understood as dangerous. They warned against watering horses upstream from where soldiers drank because trampling would muddy the river and ruin the supply. They warned against staying too long in the same place, especially in damp or foul-smelling areas, because bad air, stagnant moisture, rot, and waste were thought to spread disease. That tells us something most movie versions soften or ignore. A war camp smelled bad, and people in the Middle Ages knew that was a serious problem, not just an unpleasant detail. Human waste, horse waste, spoiled scraps, dirty ground, and contaminated water could all pile up quickly.
especially in a long siege or a slow campaign. One study of medieval horse management even notes how much waste a large horse could produce in a day, and how dangerous those accumulations could become in an encamped army. So the harsh truth is not that medieval soldiers were too ignorant to notice filth. It is almost the opposite. They noticed it enough to write rules about it, and that only makes sense if the problem was constant. A medieval camp was not a clean military base. It was a fragile attempt to hold order over mud, waste, animals, and limited water, before those things turned the camp against itself. Number 6. Sickness was the other enemy. Once water and waste start going wrong, the next enemy is obvious. It is sickness. Medieval commanders did not have modern medicine, and that made prevention far more important than cure. Military manuals from the medieval world keep returning to the same point. Find healthy ground. Avoid marshes and heavy damp. Do not stay too long in one place. Feed men properly. Protect the water. Watch for bad smells. Protect soldiers from heat, exhaustion, and polluted surroundings. One passage in the scholarship on these manuals quotes the blunt warning that a commander has no remedy when he must fight disease as well as the enemy. That line gets to the heart of camp life. A camp was dangerous even when nobody was attacking it. If soldiers grew weak from bad food, foul water, constant fatigue, damp ground, or spreading illness, the army could lose strength without ever losing a formal battle. This mattered especially during sieges, which were common in medieval Europe and often stretched on for long periods. English heritage notes that sieges demanded enormous time, money, and manpower, while Britannica points out that many medieval sieges were settled more often by starvation, disease, or treachery than by broken walls. That means camp health was not a side issue. It could decide the whole operation.
So, another harsh truth is that medieval war camps were not simply places where armies paused between fights. They were places where whole campaigns could quietly unravel. The enemy outside the walls mattered, of course, but so did fever, exhaustion, bad water, and everything else that made an army smaller before the real clash even came. Number 7. Most shelter was poor. That helps explain why shelter mattered so much, and why movie camps with endless, elegant pavilions give the wrong impression. Yes, fine tents existed. Noblemen and kings used them, and military law placed the ruler's tent at the center of camp with senior men around him. Those tents were symbols of rank as much as shelter. But one scholarly note on camp life points out that simple mud and straw huts were often more common accommodations for soldiers on the move than the idealized sea of canvas we imagine. Even when tents were available, they were not miracle solutions. A later military writer quoted in the scholarship on pre-modern camps says a cheap canvas tent offered only limited shelter, was poor against wind and cold, and was far from rainproof. That is not a medieval text, but it makes sense of an older reality. Temporary shelter could keep some weather off you, but it could not turn a field into comfort. Archaeology from the Viking camp at Torksey adds another useful image, describing the camp as the kind of place where objects were easily lost in muddy and trampled fields. That sounds a lot closer to reality than the polished camp scenes people remember from film. The harsh truth here is simple. Many medieval soldiers slept in rough conditions. The best quarters went to the top of the hierarchy. Everyone else dealt with basic tents, makeshift structures, wet ground, smoke, cold nights, and the kind of cramped rest that only partly restored strength.
Camp was where men tried to recover, but it was rarely where they were truly comfortable. Number 8. Camps were moving towns.
And poor shelter did not mean small or simple communities. In fact, one of the biggest mistakes people make is picturing a medieval war camp as nothing but fighting men. Large camps could look more like temporary towns. A Cambridge study of camp health says that by the mid-14th century, large siege camps in northwestern Europe could develop sophisticated infrastructure and become temporary towns in their own right. Archaeology backs that up. The Viking Great Army's winter camp at Torksey included not only warriors, but craft workers and merchants, with evidence of trade, metalworking, and multiple economic activities happening inside the camp. The same study argues that the camp population numbered in the thousands and probably included women and children, as well as traders and craft workers. Other scholarship on crusading notes that camp followers, households, families, and merchants were normal parts of medieval armies. This makes perfect sense once you remember how many services armies needed. Food had to be bought, transported, prepared, and sold. Equipment had to be repaired. Animals had to be handled. Messages had to move. Wounded or sick men needed at least basic care. Camps attracted markets because armies were huge concentrations of demand. They also attracted all the risk, disorder, and crowding that came with any crowded settlement. So the harsh truth is that medieval camps were not just military spaces. They were social and economic spaces too. That meant more noise, more pressure on supplies, more people to control, and more chances for disease, theft, exploitation, and confusion. A war camp in medieval Europe was often less like a heroic overnight stop and more like a tense, dirty, temporary town built for war. Number 9. Discipline was severe.
A place like that could not function without rules, and the rules could be very harsh. One famous set of ordinances from Emperor Frederick Barbarossa's army in 1158 shows just how nervous commanders were about violence and disorder inside the camp. Men were forbidden to provoke fights, to misuse the camp rallying cry, to rob merchants, to loot markets, to keep certain unauthorized people in their quarters, to mishandle another man's horse, or to burn villages recklessly. There were rules about theft, price gouging, stray servants, and even how to deal with treasure and wine so that disorder would not spread. What stands out is not just the list itself, but what the list implies. Medieval camps were full of temptations and tensions. There was money, loot, food, alcohol, animals, merchants, servants, and armed men living too close together. That was a recipe for conflict. Other evidence from Edward I's army in Scotland points in the same direction, with records touching on gambling, fighting, and disputes over booty. So when people imagine the medieval camp as a place where everyone knew their role and obeyed naturally, they are missing the point. Commanders wrote so many rules because men did not behave perfectly. Discipline had to be imposed, repeated, and enforced. And the punishments available were severe by modern standards, ranging from expulsion and confiscation to flogging, branding, and worse in some cases. That is another harsh truth. Inside a war camp, danger did not only come from the enemy. It could come from your own side, from theft, panic, greed, or a quarrel that got out of hand among exhausted, armed men. Number 10. No one was really safe. Even with discipline, the camp was never fully secure. Medieval military law makes this painfully clear. Scouts had to be sent into the surrounding country. Sentinels had to be posted by day and night. The rear guard mattered because the enemy often targeted baggage when the army was settling in. Parties sent out to fetch wood, water, grass, or straw were supposed to move under arms and stay tightly organized because that was exactly the kind of moment when an enemy hoped to strike. Another historical example from 11th century Normandy shows Duke William
trying to stop invaders from ravaging and foraging while avoiding a set battle. And English logistics during the Viking Wars show foragers roaming out for food and fodder while opposing mounted bands tried to intercept and destroy them. Add to that a broader study of medieval deception, which notes that ambushes were ubiquitous in medieval warfare, accounting for nearly a third of the incidents in one taxonomy, and the picture becomes clearer. The front line was not always a clear line. Threats existed around roads, supply routes, foraging zones, river crossings, and half-finished camps. That is why a camp was not simply a place of rest after the day's march. It was a pause inside continuing danger. Men slept, but guards stayed awake. Animals needed watching, so they were not lost or stolen. Supply groups went out knowing they might not return untouched. The harsh truth here is that medieval war camps lived under constant, low-level threat. Even when there was no grand battle, there was always the fear of surprise, raid, theft, panic, or a sudden strike at the weakest point in the system. Number 11. Waiting was the real routine. This is why the daily rhythm of camp felt so different from what movies suggest. Medieval war was not one non-stop chain of heroic field battles. A Cambridge summary of medieval warfare notes that full-scale battles were relatively rare, and English Heritage says sieges were one of the common ways to take land, resources, and trade, even though they cost huge amounts of time, money, and manpower. Britannica adds that progress in siege warfare was usually slow and painful, and that fortified places often held out until treachery, starvation, or disease broke them.
Put all that together, and the logic of the camp changes. Armies spent long stretches watching walls, guarding routes, digging defenses, escorting baggage, raiding the countryside, building engines, protecting markets, and waiting for weakness to appear. That waiting was not restful. It wore men down. Food stocks dropped. Waste built up. Horses lost condition. Discipline frayed. Weather changed. Illness spread. Morale swung with every rumor. So another harsh truth is that the most common emotion in a medieval camp was probably not cinematic courage. It was strain. A commander had to keep a temporary town together while time worked on everyone inside it. And because battle was relatively rare compared with all the other forms of pressure, camp life itself became a major part of warfare, not an empty space between exciting scenes. If you want the real picture of medieval war, you have to picture a lot more waiting, hauling, repairing, feeding, guarding, and enduring than most dramatizations are willing to show. Number 12. The land paid for it. And once you understand how much an army needed every day, the last harsh truth comes into focus. A medieval war camp did not live on its own resources. It leaned on the land around it, often very hard. Campaign records from Aragon show rulers pulling on towns, councils, merchants, roads, ports, storage buildings, muleteers, and forced loans just to keep supplies moving. The same study notes that camps constantly needed replenishment and that large mule trains were easy targets, which meant even more manpower had to be spent protecting the very supplies that kept the army alive. The Gascon preparations show officials taking over houses and warehouses, hiring fields for herds, buying cattle, sheep, bacon, fish, oats, sacks, and barrels from a wide region, and bringing all of it toward the point of embarkation. In enemy territory, the pressure could be even harsher.
Scholarship on medieval warfare stresses that ravaging and plundering were not just mindless acts. They were linked to supply and to the deliberate destruction of an enemy's economic base. English sources from the Viking Wars also show how quickly an overwintering force could consume local stocks and push foragers out into the countryside in search of grain, meat, and fodder. So the final harsh truth is that a medieval camp changed the landscape around it. It drained food, burned fuel, consumed grass, crowded roads, emptied storehouses, and pulled whole local economies into the orbit of war. The camp did not sit beside the campaign. In many ways, it was the campaign, made visible in tents, animals, carts, ditches, markets, and the constant hunger of an army trying to stay in the field.